Arizona Territory, 1887. Melanie Burnett stood on the porch of her father's trading post, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of amber and gold. The desert wind tugged gently at her simple cotton dress as she surveyed the familiar landscape that had been her home for the past 5 years. At 22, she had grown accustomed to the harsh beauty of the frontier, though she still sometimes longed for the refinement of the East, where she had spent her childhood before her mother's passing. "I'll be back within a fortnight, Melanie," her father had promised 3 days prior. His weathered face creased with concern as he mounted his horse for a supply run to Tucson. "Keep the ledger straight and don't extend any more credit to Jameson. The man's already in debt up to his eyeballs." She smiled at the memory as she brushed a stray golden lock from her face. The trading post had become her world since they'd moved west, a place where cultures collided daily as settlers, soldiers, and occasionally peaceful native traders came to barter and purchase goods. Her father had taught her to be firm but fair with everyone, regardless of their background. It was a lesson that had served her well in managing the store during his frequent absences. As the last rays of sunlight stretched across the yard, Melanie made mental notes of tasks for tomorrow. The flour barrels needed restocking, and several cavalry wives from the nearby fort had ordered fabric that would arrive with her father's return. Simple, predictable concerns that defined her existence on the frontier. She had just turned to go inside when she noticed the unusual stillness. The chirping of crickets had ceased abruptly, and even the persistent desert wind seemed to hold its breath. A chill ran down her spine despite the lingering heat of the day. Something was wrong. Melanie's eyes scanned the perimeter of the trading post, past the small corral where 2 horses grazed peacefully, to the edge of the brush where shadows had begun to lengthen. For years, her father had warned her to be vigilant, especially when alone. The frontier might be increasingly civilized, but danger still lurked in its margins. The attack came with the swiftness of a summer storm. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains, dark silhouettes materialized from the brush, Apache warriors, their faces painted for war, moving with deadly purpose toward the trading post. Melanie froze in terror as the first arrows flew past her, thudding into the wooden posts of the porch. A scream tore from her throat as she stumbled backward into the trading post, slamming the door behind her. Through the window she watched in horror as flames erupted from the barn. The Burnett's hired hand, old Samuel, emerged from the bunkhouse only to fall with an arrow in his chest. "Heaven help me," she whispered, grabbing her father's shotgun from behind the counter. Her hands trembled as she loaded it, knowing full well that against so many warriors, her chances were slim. Still, her father hadn't raised her to surrender without a fight. The door splintered inward as 2 warriors broke through. Melanie fired once, the blast deafening in the confined space. One warrior fell back, but the other advanced. She swung the shotgun like a club, connecting with his head, buying precious seconds to flee through the back door. Outside, chaos reigned. The trading post was now fully ablaze, thick smoke billowing into the darkening sky. Melanie crouched behind a water trough, searching desperately for an escape route. If she could reach the horse paddock, she might have a chance to outrun her pursuers. That's when she saw him. Standing amidst the flames and smoke was a warrior unlike the others. Taller, his presence commanding even from a distance. A single eagle feather adorned his long black hair, and intricate patterns marked his bare chest, symbols of power and authority. This was no ordinary raider. This was a chief. Their eyes met across the yard. In that moment, time seemed to stand still. The sounds of destruction faded, as Melanie found herself unable to look away from his piercing gaze. There was something in those dark eyes, intelligence, intensity, and something else she couldn't name, that struck her to her core. For Ulzana, the feared Apache chief whose name caused frontiersmen to tremble, the world suddenly narrowed to this single woman with golden hair and defiant eyes. Something stirred within him, a recognition inexplicable yet undeniable. His heart thundered in his chest as if he'd run for miles, though he stood perfectly still. A burning timber crashed nearby, breaking the spell. Melanie seized the opportunity as the warriors turned toward the noise. She slipped away into the gathering darkness, the chief's penetrating gaze branded into her memory. With nothing but the clothes on her back and a small hunting knife tucked in her boot, a gift from her father that she'd always considered too unladylike to wear openly. Melanie Burnett disappeared into the unforgiving desert, knowing the Apaches would soon be in pursuit. Behind her, Ulzana watched her flee, a strange conflict brewing within him. He raised his hand to signal his warriors to follow, then hesitated, lowering it slightly. He would lead this hunt himself. "Chief, the woman escapes," one of his warriors said in their native tongue, confusion evident in his voice. "She will not get far," Ulzana replied, his voice betraying none of the turmoil within. "The desert itself will return her to us." As his warriors continued their raid, gathering supplies and horses, Ulzana stood motionless, staring into the darkness where the golden-haired woman had vanished. In all his 36 summers, he had never experienced such a moment, as if the Great Spirit had reached down and touched his soul through the eyes of an enemy. The night deepened as Melanie pushed herself beyond exhaustion, driven by raw fear and determination. The desert, beautiful by day, had transformed into a treacherous maze of shadows and unseen dangers. Each rustle in the brush made her heart stutter with terror. Was it a rattlesnake, a coyote, or worse, an Apache tracker silently closing in? She forced herself to remember her father's lessons about the land. Stay high when possible, watch for landmarks, follow dry washes where tracking would be more difficult. But in the darkness, with only the stars and a sliver of moon for light, such wisdom offered little comfort. By midnight, her initial burst of desperate energy had faded. Melanie's throat burned with thirst, and her legs threatened to buckle with each step. She found temporary shelter beneath an overhanging rock and allowed herself a moment's rest, straining to hear any sounds of pursuit. In that moment of stillness, the enormity of her situation crashed over her. The trading post, her home, was gone. Old Samuel was dead. Her father would return to destruction, perhaps believing her killed or captured, and she was alone in one of the most unforgiving landscapes on earth, hunted by Apache warriors. A sob rose in her throat, but Melanie forced it down. Tears were a luxury she couldn't afford. They would only waste precious moisture her body desperately needed. Instead, she closed her eyes and saw again the face of the Apache chief, those eyes that had seemed to look into her very soul. Why hadn't he immediately ordered his warriors after her? And why did the memory of his gaze stir something besides fear in her heart? "Foolishness," she whispered to the empty air. "Exhaustion playing tricks on your mind." After allowing herself only minutes of rest, Melanie continued her flight. She would need to find water soon, or the desert would claim her before any Apache could. Miles behind her, Ulzana knelt beside Melanie's tracks, his fingers lightly touching the disturbed earth. Few could read sign as he could. It was a gift that had made him a legendary hunter and war chief. But today his skills served a different purpose. "She moves with purpose," he said quietly to himself in Apache, not in blind panic like most white eyes. He had left his war party behind, telling them he would scout alone. His second-in-command, Nahilzai, had questioned this decision with his eyes, if not his words. It was unusual for a chief to track a single escaped captive personally, especially a woman. Ulzana himself could not fully explain the compulsion that drove him. The raid had been successful. They had acquired horses, ammunition, and supplies needed for their people hiding in the mountains. Yet here he was, following the trail of one white woman as if she carried something precious beyond measure. As the night gave way to the first pale light of dawn, Ulzana paused beside a rocky outcropping. The woman's trail showed signs of fatigue, a dragging foot here, a handprint against a boulder there where she had steadied herself. She would not last another day without water. With this knowledge, he altered his course, heading not directly after her, but toward a small hidden spring he knew lay roughly in her path. If she survived the morning, thirst would guide her there by instinct. It was there he would wait, and there they would meet again, not as chief and captive, but as two souls drawn together by forces neither fully understood. The sun rose mercilessly over the Arizona desert, bringing with it a heat that seemed to consume the very air. Melanie had managed perhaps 4 hours of movement before finding temporary shelter beneath a shallow overhang of rock. Her lips were cracked, her tongue swollen with thirst, and the reddened skin of her face and neck burned with the intensity of fire. She knew she was facing death. Without water, the human body could not survive the desert's brutal embrace for more than a day. perhaps two if luck and shade prevailed. Yet something within her refused to surrender. Perhaps it was her father's stubborn nature, inherited through blood and years of example. Perhaps it was simply the human spirit's intrinsic resistance to its own ending. Or perhaps, whispered a voice in the recesses of her mind, it was the memory of those eyes across the burning trading post. Eyes that had awakened something she could not explain. With this thought lending her strength, Melanie pushed herself to her feet once more. She would move while the shadows still offered some protection before the sun reached its zenith and turned the landscape into an unbearable furnace. It was then she noticed a subtle change in the quality of the air, a faint moistness that seemed out of place in the parched terrain. Instinctively, she turned toward it, her body's desperate need for water overriding all other concerns. The small spring lay nestled between two boulders, a miracle of survival in the harsh landscape. The water seeped from the rock face, creating a pool barely larger than a wash basin before disappearing again into the thirsty earth. Melanie fell to her knees beside it, restraining herself from plunging her face directly into the precious liquid. Her father had warned that drinking too quickly after severe thirst could be as dangerous as no water at all. Instead, she cupped her hands, bringing small sips to her cracked lips, each swallow a blessing beyond price. So focused was she on the life-giving water that Melanie didn't immediately sense she was no longer alone. It was only as she raised her head, preparing to drink again, that she saw the reflection in the pool's surface. A tall figure standing silently behind her. Ulzana. Melanie spun around, scrambling backward, her hand reaching for the knife in her boot. But exhaustion and sudden movement conspired against her. The world tilted, darkness creeping at the edges of her vision. The last thing she saw before consciousness fled was the Apache chief moving toward her with surprising gentleness in his expression. When awareness returned, Melanie found herself lying in the shade of the larger boulder, a dampened cloth on her forehead. Night had fallen once more, and a small, nearly smokeless fire burned nearby. Across the flames sat Ulzana, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight as he watched her. "You are stronger than most," he said in surprisingly good English. The desert would have claimed many by now. Melanie struggled to sit up, wariness battling with confusion. Why had this feared war chief tracked her personally? Why was she still alive? "Why?" she managed to croak, her voice hoarse despite the water. Ulzana seemed to understand the question's deeper meaning. He studied her face for a long moment before responding. "I have fought the white man's armies for 15 summers," he said slowly. "I have seen courage in battle, fear in death. But never before have I seen what passed between us when our eyes met." He leaned forward slightly, the firelight casting shadows across the planes of his face. The old ones speak of souls that recognize each other, even across the divide of enemies. I do not yet understand this thing, but I know it is not to be ignored. Melanie stared at him, this man who should represent everything she feared, yet whose words echoed her own inexplicable feelings. "What happens now?" she asked, forcing strength into her voice despite her fear. Ulzana rose to his feet in one fluid motion, his height impressive even to Melanie, who had grown up among tall frontiersmen. "Now you must choose," he said. "Return to your people, who will soon come searching the ashes of your home, or come with me to understand what the Great Spirit has placed between us." He extended his hand across the fire. "I offer not captivity, but protection, a chance to see with new eyes." In the flickering light, with the vast desert surrounding them and the infinite stars overhead, Melanie Burnett faced the most consequential decision of her life. Every rational thought screamed for her to flee, to find her way back to civilization and the safety of her own kind. Yet as she looked into Ulzana's eyes, she saw not the savage enemy of frontier tales, but a man of depth and honor, a man who had tracked her not to destroy, but to understand, who offered not threats, but a choice. With trembling fingers, Melanie reached out and took his hand. The journey through the moonlit desert was unlike anything Melanie had ever experienced. Ulzana moved with the confidence of a man traversing his own home, while she struggled to keep pace despite her best efforts. Her body, weakened by days of exposure and minimal water, protested with every step. When she stumbled for the third time, Ulzana stopped and turned. Without a word, He offered her a strip of dried meat from a pouch at his waist. "Eat," he commanded. "It will give strength." Melanie accepted it cautiously, the rich, unfamiliar taste strange but welcome to her empty stomach. "Where are you taking me?" she finally asked, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "To a place of safety," was all he offered, resuming their journey. As they traveled, Melanie studied her companion, or captor, as she still wasn't entirely sure which term applied. Ulzana moved with fluid grace, despite his imposing size. The moonlight silvered his copper skin and glinted off the knife at his belt, yet it was the quiet authority in his bearing that most impressed her. Here was a man accustomed to command, to being obeyed without question. "Why did you come after me yourself?" Melanie ventured after another long silence. "Surely a chief has more important matters." Ulzana's pace didn't falter, but something in his posture suggested the question had struck a nerve. "I saw something," he finally replied, his deep voice barely audible above the night wind. "Something I have never seen before." "What do you mean?" He stopped then, turning to face her, his expression unreadable in the moonlight. When our eyes met across the fire, the Great Spirit spoke. I do not yet know what was said. Before Melanie could respond to this cryptic answer, Ulzana tensed, his hand moving to his knife. In one fluid motion, he pulled Melanie behind a large boulder. "Do not move," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. Moments later, she heard what his keener senses had detected, the rhythmic thud of approaching hoofbeats. Cavalry, by the sound of it. "Blue coats," Ulzana confirmed, his body coiled with tension. "A patrol." Melanie's heart raced. Soldiers meant rescue, a return to her own people. Yet something held her back from calling out. Perhaps the memory of Ulzana's words about the cavalry bringing death to his people, or perhaps something deeper she couldn't yet name. The patrol passed within 50 yards of their hiding place, 6 soldiers riding in formation, their silhouettes distinct against the starlit sky. Melanie held her breath until they disappeared over a ridge. Ulzana's eyes found hers in the darkness, questioning. He had made no move to restrain her, had given her the choice to reveal their presence. "They would have killed you," she said simply. A look of surprise followed by something like respect crossed his features. With a nod, he took her hand and led her onward. By dawn, they reached a hidden canyon, its entrance so narrow that they had to proceed in single file. Inside, the space widened dramatically, revealing a small creek lined with cottonwood trees, an oasis in the desert wilderness. "We rest here," Ulzana said, leading her to a small overhang that provided shelter. Exhausted beyond measure, Melanie sank to the ground. She watched as Ulzana efficiently built a small, nearly smokeless fire, then used a hollowed gourd to bring her water from the creek. "Drink slowly," he advised. As she sipped the cool water, Melanie studied his face in the growing light. The fearsome war chief had lines of weariness around his eyes, she noticed, and a scar that ran from temple to jaw on the left side of his face. "Your people," she began hesitantly. "Where are they?" "Safe," he answered, his tone making it clear he would say no more on that subject. "My father will be looking for me," Melanie said after a moment. "When he returns and finds the trading post destroyed." "He will think you dead," Ulzana finished for her. "Perhaps it is better so." Anger flashed through Melanie. "Better? That my father grieves needlessly?" Ulzana's expression remained impassive. "What life awaits you if you return? Your home is gone. And any white woman who has been with the Apache—" He left the implication hanging. The harsh truth of his words struck Melanie like a physical blow. She had heard the whispers about women taken by natives, how they were never truly accepted back into white society, always viewed with suspicion and often outright hostility. "So, I am your prisoner after all," she said bitterly. "No." Ulzana's response was immediate and firm. "You are under my protection. There is a difference. Protection from what? From my warriors, who would see you as spoils of war. From settlers, who would see you as tainted. From soldiers, who would use you to find us, then discard you." His dark eyes held hers. "From a world that has no place for either of us as we truly are." The raw honesty in his voice silenced her protests. This man, this supposed enemy, was showing her more respect than she might receive from her own people if she returned. As the day progressed, they rested in the canyon's shelter. Ulzana left briefly, returning with 2 rabbits, which he expertly prepared and cooked. The simple meal was the most satisfying Melanie could remember. "That scar," she said afterward, gesturing to his face. "How did you get it?" Ulzana's hand rose unconsciously to touch the mark. "My first battle against the Blue Coats. I was 17 summers. And you've been fighting ever since?" A shadow crossed his face. "The Apache way is being destroyed. Our hunting grounds taken, our people driven into the barren places, our children sent to schools where they beat our language from their tongues." His voice remained controlled, but Melanie could sense the deep well of anger beneath. "What would you have me do?" The question caught her off guard. What indeed? For the first time, Melanie truly considered the native perspective, not as her father's occasional customers, nor as the dangerous savages of frontier tales, but as people fighting for their very existence. "I don't know," she admitted honestly. Ulzana studied her face, seeming to find something there that satisfied him. "Few of your people would even ask the question." As evening approached, Melanie found herself drawn to the creek. She knelt beside it, looking at her reflection in the still water. 5 days in the desert had left their mark. Her skin was reddened by the sun, her golden hair tangled with dust and twigs, her clothes torn and stained. Yet there was something different in her eyes, a new awareness that had nothing to do with her physical appearance. The sound of soft footfalls alerted her to Ulzana's approach. He crouched beside her, his own reflection joining hers in the water. "The desert changes those who survive it," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "It strips away what is false." "And what is left?" Melanie asked, meeting his gaze in the water's reflection. "Truth?" Ulzana dipped his hand in the creek, sending ripples across their mirrored images. Sometimes painful, always valuable. They sat in companionable silence as the shadows lengthened. Melanie found herself strangely at ease in this man's presence, a man who by all rights should have been her enemy, yet who had shown her nothing but respect. "Will you tell me about your people?" she asked. "Not as my father's books describe them, but as they truly are." Something like surprise flickered in Ulzana's eyes, followed by cautious approval. He began to speak, his deep voice painting pictures of Apache life, their deep connection to the land, their ceremonies, their struggles as white settlements expanded. He spoke of his rise to war chief, after proving himself not only brave in battle, but wise in counsel. "My people are proud," he explained, as the first stars appeared above the canyon. "Too proud, perhaps, to see that the old ways cannot continue unchanged. But the ways the white man offers destroy what makes us Apache." "Surely there must be a middle path," Melanie suggested. Ulzana's expression darkened. "Those who seek it are called traitors by both sides." The words hung in the night air, weighted with personal experience. Melanie sensed that Ulzana himself walked a dangerous line between tradition and the necessity of change. "And what of your people?" he asked, turning the conversation. "What truths do they hide behind their church steeples and cavalry forts?" The directness of the question startled Melanie, but she found herself answering with equal honesty. She spoke of the East's hypocrisy, how the same society that preached Christian charity often practiced ruthless ambition. She described her father's disillusionment after her mother's death, his retreat to the frontier, where rules were simpler, if harsher. "He taught me to see people as they are, not as their race or station dictates," she said. "It made me different from other settler women." "Different," Ulzana echoed, "yet still of your people, as I am of mine." As night deepened, the temperature dropped dramatically, a common desert phenomenon that still surprised Melanie. She shivered despite herself. Without comment, Ulzana rose and retrieved a blanket from his few supplies, draping it around her shoulders. The gesture, simple yet considerate, touched Melanie deeply. It spoke of respect, of seeing her needs and addressing them without expectation. "Thank you," she said, meaning more than just the blanket. Ulzana nodded, understanding in his eyes. He settled nearby, close enough for conversation, yet maintaining a respectful distance. "Tomorrow," he said, "we will move again. This place is safe, but we cannot remain long." "Where will we go?" Ulzana considered the question. "There is a place in the mountains where my people gather when threats grow too great. Few whites know of it." "And you would take me there?" Melanie asked, surprised. "Would your people accept my presence?" A complex expression crossed Ulzana's face. "Some will not, But I am still chief. My word carries weight. He paused, studying her face in the firelight. And you have proven yourself worthy of trust. By not alerting the patrol? By seeing me as a man, not just an enemy. The simple statement carried profound meaning. In the space of days, both had crossed boundaries that had seemed impermeable, from fear to cautious respect, from enemies to something neither could yet name. As Melanie drifted toward sleep, wrapped in the borrowed blanket beneath the star-filled sky, she found herself facing questions that had never before entered her mind. What would happen when they reached Ulzana's people? Could she truly live among the Apache even temporarily? And what of her father? Would she ever see him again? Yet beneath these practical concerns lay something deeper, more troubling in its intensity. The connection she felt with Ulzana defied all logic, all the lessons of her upbringing. It wasn't romantic, or at least not in any way she recognized from novels or her parents' marriage. It was something both simpler and more profound, a recognition of kindred spirits despite every circumstance that should have made them adversaries. Across the dying fire, Ulzana watched Melanie's features relax in sleep. The woman continued to surprise him. Where he had expected fear, she showed courage. Where prejudice should have been, she offered understanding. She had adapted to the harsh desert with a resilience few possessed, and she had looked into his eyes without flinching from what she saw there. In all his years of fighting, Ulzana had never encountered anyone like Melanie Burnett. The Great Spirit had placed her in his path for a reason. Of this he was certain. What that reason might be, however, remained a mystery that both troubled and intrigued him. One thing was clear. Protecting this woman would require more than his skill with weapons. It would demand a confrontation with his own people's traditions and his own heart's unexpected stirrings. With this thought weighing on his mind, Ulzana settled into the light sleep of a warrior, alert to danger, yet resting enough to maintain strength. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions. For tonight at least they had found a moment of peace in a world that offered little of that precious commodity. Dawn broke over the canyon with golden light. Melanie woke to find Ulzana already active, checking their surroundings for any signs of intrusion. The efficiency of his movements spoke of years spent in vigilance, never fully at ease. "We leave within the hour," he said, noticing her awakened state. "Eat this." He offered a mixture of dried berries and nuts, simple trail food but nourishing. As they prepared to depart, Melanie felt a strange reluctance to leave the canyon. It had been a place of respite, of conversation that had begun to bridge the vast gulf between their worlds. Ahead lay uncertainty, the reaction of Ulzana's people, the dangers of travel, the complications of her increasingly confused feelings. "Are you ready?" Ulzana asked, studying her face with those perceptive eyes that seemed to read more than she wished to reveal. Melanie straightened her shoulders, calling on the strength that had sustained her through the desert's trials. "Yes," she answered simply. As they moved through the narrow entrance to the canyon, returning to the wider world beyond, both sensed that they were crossing more than just a physical threshold. They were stepping into a future neither could predict, bound together by circumstances and connections that defied the bitter history between their peoples. The desert stretched before them, harsh and beautiful in the morning light, and somewhere beyond its shimmering horizon lay answers to questions neither had yet fully formed, about themselves, about each other, and about the possibility of finding common ground in a land divided by hatred and fear. The journey to the Apache stronghold took 3 days of careful travel. Ulzana led them through hidden paths in the rugged landscape, avoiding the more frequented routes where cavalry patrols or settler parties might be encountered. For Melanie, it was a journey of discovery, not just of the breathtaking terrain, but of the man who guided her through it. Ulzana possessed an intimate knowledge of the land that went beyond mere familiarity. He read the desert as easily as Melanie might read a book, finding water where she saw only parched earth, identifying edible plants amid what appeared to be nothing but hostile vegetation. More surprising was his willingness to share this knowledge, explaining the uses of various plants or the meaning of animal signs they encountered. "Your people see the desert as an enemy to be conquered," he observed, as they rested in the shade of a rock formation during the heat of the second day. "The Apache see it as a harsh teacher, one who rewards respect and punishes carelessness." "And which am I to the desert?" Melanie asked, wiping perspiration from her brow. Her rare smile touched Ulzana's lips. A quick student. By the third day, they began to climb into more mountainous terrain. The air grew cooler, the vegetation changed, and Melanie sensed they were nearing their destination. Ulzana grew more vigilant, frequently stopping to listen or examine the path ahead. "Your people have patrols in these mountains?" Melanie asked after one such pause. Ulzana nodded. "And my people have sentries. We approach a place few whites have seen, and none have left to speak of it." The gravity of his words was not lost on Melanie. "Will I be in danger from your warriors?" Ulzana's dark eyes met hers. "You are under my protection. But—" he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "It would be unwise to wander alone. Some wounds between our peoples run too deep for reason alone to heal." As afternoon shadows lengthened across the mountainside, they crested a ridge, and Melanie caught her first glimpse of the hidden Apache encampment. Nestled in a protected valley, dozens of wickiups, dome-shaped dwellings of brush and hide, stood in grouped circles. Smoke from cooking fires rose in thin columns against the backdrop of steep cliffs that shielded the camp from three sides. "It's beautiful," she whispered, genuinely moved by the sight. This was not the crude, savage camp of frontier stories, but an organized community, carefully positioned for both protection and access to water from the small stream that bisected the valley. "It is the last true home my people have," Ulzana replied, a hint of sadness in his voice. "Each season more are forced onto the reservation. Soon, perhaps, this too will be lost." They stood for a moment in silence, Melanie absorbing both the scene before her and the weight of Ulzana's words. Then, with a slight gesture, he indicated they should proceed down the path toward the camp. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. Children were the first to spot them, calling out in Apache and running toward the center of the camp. Women paused in their work, men reached for weapons, and within moments a crowd had gathered at the edge of the settlement to witness the unprecedented sight of their war chief, returning with a white woman walking freely at his side. Ulzana raised his hand in a gesture of reassurance, speaking rapidly in Apache. Melanie couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear, part explanation, part command. Some faces in the crowd showed hostility, others curiosity, and a few, particularly among the older members, displayed a careful neutrality that suggested they were reserving judgment. A tall warrior stepped forward, his bearing almost as commanding as Ulzana's own. This was Nahilzai, Ulzana's second-in-command, whom he had mentioned during their journey. The two men spoke in low, intense tones, with occasional glances toward Melanie. She stood straight, refusing to show fear despite the hostile stares from some of the warriors. Her father had taught her that respect was earned through dignity, not submission, and she sensed that the Apache would recognize and respond to strength of character. Finally, Ulzana turned to her. "You will stay in the dwelling of Nita, the medicine woman. She speaks some English and can help you understand our ways." An elderly woman had approached during their conversation. Despite her age, Nita stood straight, her face a map of experience etched in deep lines. Her eyes, however, were sharp and assessing as they took in Melanie's appearance. "This one has survived the desert," she said in accented but clear English. "That is something for a white woman." "She is under my protection," Ulzana stated firmly. Nita nodded slowly. "Come then. You need food and rest before the council meets." As Melanie followed the old woman toward one of the larger wickiups, she felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. She was a curiosity, an anomaly, potentially even a threat in their midst. Only Ulzana's authority stood between her and possible harm, a realization that both reassured and unsettled her. Inside Nita's dwelling, the air was cool and fragrant with herbs that hung in bundles from the curved supports. The old woman gestured for Melanie to sit on a woven mat, then busied herself preparing a simple meal of corn cakes and dried meat softened in broth. "Ulzana says your eyes met across fire," Nita said abruptly, her back still turned. "That the Great Spirit spoke." Melanie hesitated, uncertain how to respond to this direct reference to the connection she and Ulzana had acknowledged but barely discussed. "Something happened," she admitted carefully. "Something I cannot explain." Nita turned, fixing Melanie with a penetrating stare. "The old stories tell of souls that recognize each other across many lives. rare but not unknown. She set a wooden bowl of food before Melanie. But, between Apache and white, this has not been heard before. I didn't choose this, Melanie said, feeling a need to defend herself. Nor did he, Nita replied with surprising gentleness. The Great Spirit chooses for reasons beyond our understanding. We can only follow where the path leads. Before their conversation could continue, a commotion outside drew their attention. Raised voices, the tone unmistakably confrontational, carried through the dwelling's walls. Nita's expression grew troubled. The council gathers earlier than expected. Some are not pleased with your presence. Melanie set down her barely touched food. Should I go to them? Explain myself. No. Nita's response was immediate and firm. This is for Ulzana to resolve. A woman, especially a white woman, would not be welcome at such a council. Forced into inaction, Melanie could only wait and wonder what was being decided about her fate. Through the dwelling's entrance, she caught glimpses of warriors gathering in the central area of the camp, their postures tense, their voices growing more heated. What are they saying? She asked Nita, who stood listening intently. The old woman frowned. Some call for you to be sent away. Others say you should be held as a prisoner to exchange for Apache captives. A few, she hesitated, a few suggest that your presence is an omen of bad fortune that can only be removed by your death. Melanie's blood ran cold at these words, but she fought to maintain her composure. And Ulzana? He speaks of visions and signs, of the wisdom of listening when the Great Spirit speaks in unexpected ways. Nita shook her head slightly. It is difficult. He asks much of men who have lost wives and children to the blue coats and settlers. As the argument outside intensified, Melanie found herself torn between fear for her own safety and concern for Ulzana. He was risking his authority, perhaps even his position as chief, to protect her, a woman he barely knew from a people who had caused his own immeasurable suffering. I should never have come here, she whispered. I've only brought him trouble. Nita's weathered hand touched Melanie's arm in a surprisingly comforting gesture. Trouble finds all who walk new paths. The question is whether the path leads to something worth the journey's hardship. Suddenly, silence fell over the camp. Through the dwelling opening, Melanie saw Ulzana standing at the center of the gathering, his posture rigid with authority. He spoke a few words in a tone that brooked no argument, then turned and walked directly toward Nita's wickiup. He ducked inside, his face impassive but tension evident in the set of his shoulders. The council is divided, he said without preamble. You may stay for now, but under strict conditions. You must not leave this area without escort, and you must make yourself useful to the camp. Relief washed over Melanie. Thank you. I'll do whatever is needed. It was not easily won, Ulzana admitted, his voice lowered so only she and Nita could hear. Nahilzai and the younger warriors wanted you gone, or worse. Only the words of the elders who still respect visions and signs tipped the balance. What happens now? Melanie asked. Now, Nita interjected, you learn our ways. Show that you respect the Apache people. Give them reason to see you as more than just an enemy. Ulzana nodded in agreement. I must leave at dawn to scout the cavalry movements. They have been moving closer to our sanctuary in recent weeks. I will return in 3 days. His eyes held Melanie's. Can you survive among my people until then? The question carried multiple layers of meaning. Could she physically survive? Would she attempt escape? Could she withstand the hostility she would undoubtedly face? Yes, she answered simply, holding his gaze. Something like approval flickered in Ulzana's eyes. With a brief nod to Nita, he departed, leaving Melanie to contemplate the challenge ahead. The following days tested Melanie in ways she had never anticipated. True to her word, she threw herself into camp life, offering assistance wherever it was accepted. Many of the women initially refused her help, turning their backs when she approached. But Melanie persisted, starting with the most basic tasks, gathering firewood, carrying water from the stream, preparing hides for tanning. Nita proved an unexpected ally, instructing her in Apache ways and translating when necessary. The old medicine woman seemed to have adopted Melanie as a project of sorts, perhaps seeing in her a means of understanding the white world that increasingly encroached upon Apache life. Your hands were soft when you came, Nita observed on the second day, examining Melanie's blistered palms after hours of grinding corn. Now they begin to know real work. I worked at the trading post, Melanie protested mildly. Nita made a dismissive sound. Store work, not life work. But her tone held no malice, only the matter-of-factness of one who had survived in harsh conditions all her life. Gradually, some of the camp's residents began to thaw toward Melanie. It started with the children, naturally curious and less burdened by history's weight. They would watch her from a distance, giggling when she noticed them, eventually growing bold enough to approach and touch her golden hair in wondering fascination. A few of the women, seeing her willingness to work without complaint, began to offer small gestures of inclusion, a wordless demonstration of a more efficient technique for a task, a bowl of stew shared at the day's end, a nod of acknowledgement when passing. Not all were won over, of course. Nahilzai and his supporters maintained a cold distance, watching Melanie with undisguised suspicion. She felt their eyes on her constantly, evaluating, judging, waiting perhaps for some mistake that would justify their hostility. On the afternoon of the third day, as Melanie helped a young mother named Kizzy hang strips of meat to dry, she noticed unusual activity at the camp's perimeter. Warriors were gathering, weapons in hand, their postures alert and tense. "What's happening?" she asked Kizzy, whose limited English had been improving through their shared work. The young woman's expression grew worried. "Scouts see dust, many horses, maybe soldiers." Melanie's heart rate quickened. Cavalry, this close to the hidden camp. It could only mean that someone had discovered the Apache sanctuary or was dangerously close to doing so. The implications struck her with sudden clarity. If soldiers found this place, there would be bloodshed. The women and children would suffer alongside the warriors. Ulzana, due to return today, might ride unknowingly into an ambush. A terrible choice loomed before her. She could remain silent, protecting her newfound place among the Apache, or she could use her knowledge of cavalry tactics, gleaned from years of interaction with soldiers at the trading post, to help those who still viewed her as a potential enemy. The decision, when it came, was surprisingly easy. Melanie strode purposefully toward the gathering warriors, ignoring the warning hand Kizzy placed on her arm. Nahilzai stood at the center of the group, issuing rapid instructions. He stopped mid-sentence when he saw Melanie approaching, his face hardening with suspicion. "I can help," she said clearly, meeting his hostile gaze without flinching. "I know how cavalry units operate in these mountains." "So you can signal them? Lead them to us?" One of the younger warriors spat. Melanie shook her head firmly. "If I wanted to betray you, I would have done so when the patrol passed us days ago." She turned back to Nahilzai, instinctively recognizing him as the decision-maker in Ulzana's absence. "Your people have shown me both suspicion and kindness, but there are children here, women who have done nothing to deserve the cavalry's justice." For a long moment, Nahilzai studied her face, searching perhaps for signs of deception. Then, with a curt nod, he gestured for her to join the council. Over the next hour, Melanie shared everything she knew about cavalry search patterns, the limitations of their horses in mountainous terrain, and the likely approaches they would take if they suspected an Apache encampment was nearby. The warriors listened with initial skepticism that gradually transformed into reluctant respect as the practical value of her knowledge became apparent. Together, they devised a strategy to misdirect the patrol. False trails leading away from the camp, carefully placed signs suggesting the area had been abandoned days earlier, strategic use of the terrain to conceal the actual location of their sanctuary. As the warriors prepared to implement their plan, Nahilzai approached Melanie. "You help us against your own kind," he said, not a question, but an observation. "I help people who have sheltered me," Melanie replied simply. "People whose only crime is wanting to live according to their own ways." Something shifted in Nahilzai's expression, not quite acceptance, but perhaps the beginning of reassessment. With a brief nod that conveyed more than words could have, he turned to lead his men into position. Melanie returned to the camp proper, where the women were preparing for possible evacuation, gathering essential supplies and quieting frightened children. She joined them without hesitation, falling into the rhythm of their preparations, no longer an outsider but a participant in their struggle for survival. As dusk approached, a lone figure appeared on the ridge above the camp, Ulzana, returning as promised. He took in the situation at a glance, conferring briefly with the sentries before making his way swiftly to where Nahilzai awaited his return. From where she helped Kizzy secure a bundle of medicinal herbs, Melanie watched the two men in intense conversation, Nahilzai gesturing occasionally toward her. Ulzana's expression remained impassive, but something in his posture suggested both surprise and approval. Later, as the camp settled into an uneasy vigilance, Ulzana sought Melanie out where she sat near Nita's dwelling, exhaustion finally catching up with her after the day's tensions. "Nahilzai tells me you helped plan our defense," he said, lowering himself to sit beside her. Melanie nodded, suddenly uncertain how Ulzana would view her intervention. "It seemed right." "It was right," he confirmed, "and unexpected. My second-in-command is not easily impressed, especially by those he considers enemies." "And what does he consider me now?" Ulzana's mouth curved in a slight smile. "A puzzle. As do I, sometimes." The cavalry patrol passed within a mile of the camp the following morning, following exactly the false trail Melanie had suggested they would find most credible. By noon, they had disappeared back down the mountain, their dust trail visible for hours afterward as they returned to their fort, unaware of how close they had come to their quarry. The incident marked a turning point in Melanie's acceptance among the Apache. No longer was she merely tolerated as Ulzana's strange protected one. She had proven her loyalty in a moment of crisis, choosing their safety over the opportunity to return to her own people. Even Nahilzai, still reserved, now acknowledged her with a respectful nod when their paths crossed. The women included her more readily in their tasks and conversations, often asking through gestures or broken English about life in the white settlements. Most significant was the change in her relationship with Ulzana. The cautious distance he had maintained, perhaps out of respect for her position as a woman alone among his people, perhaps from his own uncertainty about the connection between them, began to ease. They spoke more freely, sharing thoughts and observations as the days passed. One evening, as they walked along the stream that ran through the camp, Ulzana asked the question Melanie had been expecting since her decision to help against the cavalry. "Do you regret not returning to your people when you had the chance?" Melanie considered the question seriously as it deserved. "I miss my father," she admitted. "I worry about his grief, thinking me dead. But," she paused, searching for words to express the complex evolution of her feelings, "I have seen things here I never expected. Strength, dignity, family bonds that survive despite everything your people have endured." She looked up at Ulzana, finding his dark eyes intent on her face. "The stories we settlers tell about the Apache, they're wrong in so many ways, or at least incomplete. As are the stories my people tell about whites," Ulzana acknowledged. "The truth is rarely found in the tales enemies tell of each other." They walked in companionable silence for a few moments, the setting sun casting long shadows across the valley. "What happens now?" Melanie finally asked, echoing the question she had posed days earlier in the hidden canyon. Ulzana stopped, turning to face her directly. "Now we acknowledge what grows between us," he said, his voice deeper, more personal than she had heard before. "This thing that began when our eyes met across the burning trading post." Melanie's heart quickened at his directness. The connection between them had strengthened with each passing day, evolving from curiosity to respect to something far more profound. She had tried to deny it, to attribute it to the extraordinary circumstances of their meeting, but the truth could no longer be ignored. "The Great Spirit sometimes places souls in unexpected paths," Ulzana continued, reaching out to touch her cheek with gentle fingers. "I have fought the white man for 15 summers. I have lost family, friends, parts of myself to this war. Yet when I saw you standing amid the flames, something inside me remembered peace." The touch of his hand, warm against her skin, sent a tremor through Melanie that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition of a truth that transcended the boundaries others had established between them. "I don't know what this means," she whispered, "how it can possibly work." "Nor do I," Ulzana admitted, his rare vulnerability touching her deeply. "I only know that to deny it would be to deny the Great Spirit's voice." As the last light of day gilded the landscape around them, Melanie made her choice. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and placed her hand over Ulzana's heart. "Then we listen," she said simply, "and find the path together." The kiss that followed was gentle, tentative, a first exploration of territory both feared might be forbidden. Yet in that moment of connection, something shifted in the world around them, not just between a man and a woman, but between the opposing forces they represented. It was a beginning, fragile, uncertain, faced with obstacles neither could fully anticipate. But as they stood together in the gathering twilight, Melanie knew with sudden clarity that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them not as enemies, not even merely as allies, but as two souls who had recognized each other across the seemingly impassable divides of history and hatred. And in that recognition lay the seeds of a future neither could have imagined when their eyes first met across the flames of a burning trading post. The weeks that followed marked a transformation in Melanie's life, unlike anything she could have imagined. What had begun as captivity had evolved into belonging, and what had started as a strange connection with Ulzana had deepened into an undeniable bond that both still struggled to define. The Apache camp, initially so foreign and intimidating, now felt familiar. Melanie had learned the rhythms of daily life, the women's work of preparing food, curing hides, and crafting the necessities of survival, the warriors' patterns of hunting, scouting, and protecting their hidden sanctuary, the children's education in both practical skills and tribal traditions. More surprising was how she had found her place within this community. Her knowledge of medicinal plants, learned from her mother's books and expanded through trading with native customers, had made her valuable to Nita, who now treated Melanie as something between an apprentice and a daughter. The old medicine woman's initially guarded attitude had transformed into genuine affection and a determination to teach Melanie everything she could about Apache healing traditions. "Your hands are good for this work," Nita observed one afternoon as they prepared a poultice for a child's fever. "They feel the plant's spirits." Such acceptance, however, did not extend to all. Though most of the camp had come to tolerate or even appreciate Melanie's presence, a faction led by a warrior named Chato remained openly hostile. Chato, whose family had been killed by cavalry soldiers during a raid on their previous camp, viewed any white person as an enemy beyond redemption. "He watches you with snake eyes," Kizzy warned Melanie one day as they worked together. "Be careful when Ulzana is away." The warning was unnecessary. Melanie had felt Chato's hatred from the moment she arrived and had learned to be vigilant whenever he was nearby. Still, she refused to show fear, meeting his glares with calm dignity that seemed to infuriate him further. Ulzana was well aware of the tension. Though his position as chief remained secure, strengthened even by the successful evasion of the cavalry patrol, he knew that his relationship with Melanie created complications for his leadership. He had begun taking her with him on short scouting expeditions, partly to remove her from Chato's threatening presence, but also to share with her the land he loved. It was during one such expedition, as they sat atop a mesa overlooking the vast landscape below, that Ulzana spoke of the future for the first time. "The reservation cannot be avoided forever," he said, his gaze on the distant horizon. "Each season, more of my people surrender, seeing no other path to survival." "Will you ever consider it?" Melanie asked carefully, knowing how deeply he resisted the idea of confinement on government-allocated land. Ulzana's expression hardened. "To live as prisoners, dependent on the army for food that often doesn't come. To watch our children sent to schools where they beat them for speaking their own language." He shook his head. "I would rather die fighting." "There must be another way," Melanie said, laying her hand gently on his arm. "Some path between surrender and destruction." Ulzana covered her hand with his own, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "Perhaps. But who would help us find it? The army wants only our submission or our extinction. The settlers want our land." Melanie was silent for a moment, considering a thought that had been forming in her mind for days. "My father," she finally said. "He has connections with territorial officials, respect among settlers. If he knew I was alive, if he understood what I've seen here." She trailed off, seeing the complex emotions that crossed Ulzana's face. Hope, doubt, and something that might have been fear. "You wish to return to him," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Not alone," Melanie replied firmly. "Together, to build a bridge no one believes possible." The audacity of the suggestion hung between them. A white trader's daughter and an Apache war chief, approaching territorial authorities together to advocate for a new approach to the seemingly endless conflict. It was unprecedented, perhaps impossible. "They would kill me on sight," Ulzana said after a long silence. "Or imprison me to hang later." "Not if we're careful," Melanie insisted, the idea taking firmer shape as she spoke. My father's trading post was neutral ground. All were welcome there, as long as they came in peace. If we could create such a place again? A sanctuary, Ulzana mused, a hint of bitter irony in his tone, like the one my people now barely maintain in these mountains. But one recognized by both sides, Melanie pressed. A place for trade, for talking, for finding the path you spoke of, between surrender and destruction. Ulzana studied her face, his dark eyes searching hers. You truly believe this is possible? I believe we must try, she answered honestly. For your people's future. For us. It was the first time either had directly acknowledged that their connection had implications beyond themselves, that what had grown between them might somehow serve a greater purpose. Before Ulzana could respond further, the distant sound of a bird call caught his attention, a signal from the sentry he had posted below. His posture immediately shifted to alertness. Someone approaches, he said, moving swiftly to the mesa's edge. He studied the terrain below for several moments, then turned to Melanie with an expression of disbelief. Riders, 3. One appears to be your father. Melanie's heart seemed to stop. My father? Here? How is that possible? He is either a better tracker than I believed or... Ulzana's eyes narrowed. He had help finding us. The implication was clear. Someone from the camp must have found a way to send word to the settlements. Chatto's hostile face flashed in Melanie's mind. Was this his way of removing her, by bringing her father to reclaim her? Or was it a trap meant for Ulzana? We must go down, she said urgently. If it is my father, he might be in danger from your sentries. Ulzana nodded grimly. Stay close to me. This may not be the reunion you hope for. They descended rapidly, following a narrow path known only to the Apache. As they neared the base of the mesa, Ulzana signaled to the hidden sentries, instructing them to hold their position but remain vigilant. The 3 riders came into view around a bend in the canyon, George Burnett in the lead, followed by a settler Melanie recognized as Maxwell Jenkins, a man who had occasionally traded at her father's post. The 3rd rider wore the uniform of a cavalry sergeant. Melanie stepped forward instinctively, but Ulzana's hand on her arm held her back. Wait, he cautioned. Let them reveal their purpose. The riders spotted them and drew to a halt 30 paces away. George Burnett's weathered face showed a complex mix of emotions, hope, disbelief, and caution. Melanie, he called, his voice cracking slightly. Is it truly you? Yes, father, she answered, emotion threatening to overwhelm her. I'm alive. I'm safe. George moved to dismount, but the cavalry sergeant placed a restraining hand on his arm, his eyes fixed warily on Ulzana. That's Ulzana, the sergeant said, his hand moving to his sidearm, the most wanted Apache in the territory. He saved my life, Melanie stated firmly, stepping closer to Ulzana. Without him, I would have died in the desert. Confusion crossed her father's face as he took in their proximity, the protective stance Ulzana had adopted beside her. What is this? He asked. Are you his prisoner? No, father, Melanie answered, realizing the moment of truth had arrived far sooner than she'd anticipated. I'm here by choice. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. George Burnett was no fool. He could see the change in his daughter, could sense the nature of the connection between her and the Apache chief. I think we should talk, he finally said, his voice carefully controlled. All of us. The sergeant protested immediately. Burnett, I came along to help find your daughter, not to parley with the man responsible for a dozen raids on settlements and stagecoaches. And I'm grateful for your help, Sergeant Miller, George replied evenly. But my daughter is alive, standing before me and telling me this man saved her. That earns him the right to speak at the very least. An hour later, an unprecedented council convened in the shelter of a small grove near the mesa's base. George Burnett, Sergeant Miller and Maxwell Jenkins sat facing Ulzana and Melanie across a small fire. The tension was palpable, generations of hatred and mistrust hanging in the air between them. It was Melanie who broke the silence, relating the events since the attack on the trading post. Her escape into the desert, Ulzana finding her, their journey to the Apache camp, and her growing understanding of the desperate situation his people faced. The stories we tell about each other, they're not the whole truth, father, she concluded. I've seen it with my own eyes. The Apache fight because they have no choice. Their children are starving on reservations or being taken from them. Their hunting grounds are disappearing. And our settlers, Jenkins interjected harshly. The families killed in raids? The stagecoaches ambushed? Was that also no choice? Some raids are by young warriors I cannot control, Ulzana said, speaking for the first time. Others are by those who have lost everything and see no future except revenge. And some, his gaze shifted pointedly to Sergeant Miller, some attacks blamed on Apache were not our doing at all. The sergeant shifted uncomfortably. What are you suggesting? That soldiers have attacked isolated homesteads while dressed as Apache, Ulzana stated flatly. My scouts have found the evidence. Blue coat buttons beside bodies, army horseshoes in tracks. That's a serious accusation, George Burnett said, his brow furrowed. Why would soldiers do such a thing? To ensure the territory remains under military control, Ulzana replied. Peace brings settlers. Settlers bring civilian government. Army loses power. Sergeant Miller's face had reddened with anger. That's a damned lie. Is it? Melanie asked quietly. Father, remember the Wagner family? Their farm was attacked last spring, supposedly by Apache, but Mr. Wagner told you before he died that the raiders spoke English to each other when they thought no one could hear. George Burnett's expression darkened with memory. I reported it to the fort commander. Nothing came of it. A heavy silence fell over the group as the implications sank in. The conflict that had claimed so many lives on both sides was more complex and perhaps more deliberately perpetuated than any of them had realized. What do you propose? George finally asked, looking between his daughter and Ulzana. Melanie exchanged a glance with Ulzana, drawing strength from the steadiness in his eyes. A new beginning, she said. Rebuild the trading post, but as a neutral ground where Apache and settlers can meet in peace. A place for fair trade, for resolving disputes without bloodshed. Impossible, Jenkins scoffed. No settler would trust their safety to the word of an Apache. And no Apache would trust settlers or soldiers to honor agreements, Ulzana countered. Yet here we sit, talking instead of fighting, because of one woman who saw beyond fear. All eyes turned to Melanie, standing now between the worlds that had defined the territory's bloody history. It won't be easy, she acknowledged. But continuing as we have been ensures only more death on both sides. My father's trading post was once respected by all who came there. It can be so again. George Burnett studied his daughter with new eyes, seeing not the girl he had left behind, but a woman transformed by extraordinary circumstances. His gaze shifted to Ulzana, measuring the Apache chief with the experienced judgment of a man who had survived decades on the frontier. My daughter seems to trust you, he said finally. That counts for something in my ledger, as does her courage in mine, Ulzana replied with equal directness. A fragile understanding began to form between the two men, not friendship, but perhaps the seeds of respect that might, with careful tending, grow into something more. Sergeant Miller remained skeptical, but the evidence of his own comrades' possible treachery had shaken his certainties. Maxwell Jenkins, whose brother had died in an Apache raid, still radiated hostility, but even he seemed affected by the unusual tableau before him, a white woman standing as equal beside an Apache chief, speaking with conviction of a different path. As the council continued into the afternoon, possibilities that would have seemed unthinkable hours before began to take tentative shape. The trading post would be rebuilt, its neutrality guaranteed by both Ulzana's word and George Burnett's reputation. Ulzana would provide information on renegade bands that had broken from Apache leadership. George would use his connections with territorial officials to ensure that provisions promised a reservation Apache actually reached them. And what of you two? George finally asked, addressing the question that had hovered unspoken throughout their discussions. What place do you see for yourselves in this arrangement? Melanie felt Ulzana's hand find hers, a gesture that did not go unnoticed by the others. We stand between worlds, she said simply. Perhaps that is where we are meant to be. The implications of her words hung in the air, a declaration that transcended the immediate concerns of peace treaties and trading arrangements. Melanie Burnett, daughter of a respected frontier trader, had given her heart to Ulzana, war chief of the Apache. George Burnett's weathered face showed the internal struggle this realization provoked. Yet as he looked at his daughter, the certainty in her eyes, the strength in her bearing, something in his expression shifted toward acceptance. "The world won't make it easy for you," he said finally, "either of you." "When has the world made anything easy for frontier women?" Melanie replied with a hint of the quiet humor that had always connected her to her father. "Or for Apache chiefs who seek peace instead of war?" As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the land, the unlikely council reached its conclusion. No formal treaty had been signed, no official agreements ratified, yet something unprecedented had been achieved, a first tentative step across the chasm that had divided peoples and defined the bloody history of the territory. When the three visitors prepared to depart, George Burnett embraced his daughter with fierce emotion. "Come home when you're ready," he whispered. "Both of you. We'll build something new from the ashes." Melanie felt tears spring to her eyes at these words, her father's blessing, however qualified, for the path she and Ulzana had chosen. As they watched the riders disappear into the gathering dusk, Ulzana's arm encircled Melanie's waist, drawing her close against his side. "Your father is an unusual man," he observed. "Now I understand where your courage comes from." "He surprised me too," Melanie admitted, leaning into his embrace. "I never thought he could see beyond what he was taught to see," Ulzana finished for her. "Few men can. It is a rare gift." They stood in companionable silence, the weight of the day's events settling around them like the evening's quiet. The future they had begun to envision still seemed fragile, perhaps impossible in a world defined by hatred and mistrust. Yet in this moment, with the memory of that unprecedented council fresh in their minds, hope felt not merely desirable, but attainable. "What happens now?" Melanie asked softly. "To us?" Ulzana turned to face her, his expression solemn yet tender in the fading light. "That depends on what you want, Melanie Burnett." "I want what shouldn't be possible," she answered honestly. "I want a life where I don't have to choose between worlds." Ulzana reached out slowly, his hand cupping her cheek with a gentleness that belied his warrior's strength. "Then we must build such a world, stone by stone." In the silver light of the desert evening, their lips met in a kiss that transcended the boundaries of race and history, a promise of something new being born from the ashes of conflict. Two souls who had recognized each other across seemingly insurmountable divides, now joined in a commitment to forge a path where others might follow. The challenges ahead would be immense: resistance from both sides, the weight of history, the practical complications of bridging worlds that had known only enmity. But as Melanie and Ulzana stood together beneath the vast desert sky, they shared a certainty that their meeting had been no accident of fate, but a beginning orchestrated by forces greater than themselves, a beginning that might, with courage and perseverance, transform not just their own lives but the future of a land torn by hatred and bloodshed, one heart, one mind, one impossible connection at a time. 5 years later, the trading post at the crossroads stood as a testament to what many had deemed impossible. Rebuilt from the ashes of the old Burnett store, it now served as more than a simple mercantile establishment. It had become a symbol of a fragile but growing peace in a territory long defined by conflict. A sign above the door read, "Burnett & Son Trading Company," though those familiar with the truth understood that the son was in fact Ulzana, whose marriage to Melanie had scandalized some and inspired others. The union, performed in both Apache ceremony and through a quiet civil service conducted by a progressive territorial judge, had become the physical embodiment of the bridge they sought to build between worlds. On this particular summer morning, a small boy of 4 winters ran across the packed earth of the yard, his copper skin glowing in the sunlight, his mother's golden hair falling in waves around a face that perfectly blended his parents' features. Little Thomas Ulzana Burnett, named for both his grandfather and his father, chased a wooden hoop, his laughter echoing in the clear desert air. Watching from the shade of the porch, Melanie cradled their second child, a daughter just 6 months old with serious dark eyes that already held her father's intensity. The infant, named Nita after the old medicine woman who had become Melanie's teacher and had passed to the spirit world the previous winter, represented the continuation of their unlikely legacy. Nearby, George Burnett, now grey-haired but still robust, whittled a small wooden horse for his grandson. The old trader had surprised everyone, perhaps even himself, by becoming the most vocal advocate for the peaceful coexistence his daughter and son-in-law embodied. His connections with territorial officials, combined with the respect he commanded among settlers, had proven invaluable in transforming their vision into reality. "Papa's coming!" Thomas shouted suddenly, abandoning his hoop to race toward the approaching riders. Ulzana dismounted in one fluid motion, sweeping his son into his arms. The years had added a few lines to his face, but had done nothing to diminish his commanding presence. The difference was in his eyes. Where once there had been only the hard gaze of a warrior, there now resided the balanced wisdom of a peacemaker. Behind him rode 3 Apache men and 2 settlers, members of the council that now regularly met to resolve disputes and maintain the hard-won peace of the region. Among them was Nahilzai, once Ulzana's skeptical second-in-command, now a respected voice for cooperation while maintaining Apache traditions. "The treaty will hold," Ulzana confirmed, as he climbed the steps to embrace Melanie and the baby. "The new governor has signed the accords." It had been a long journey from that first tentative agreement to this more comprehensive peace. There had been setbacks, renegade attacks, settler violations, political opposition from those who profited from conflict. Yet step by step, the fragile trust had grown. Sergeant Miller, now Colonel Miller, and the regional military commander arrived shortly after, dismounting and joining them on the porch. His initial skepticism had transformed over the years into cautious support, especially after his own investigation confirmed Ulzana's accusations about soldiers staging false Apache raids. The exposure of this deception had led to court-martials and a significant restructuring of military leadership in the territory. "Washington has finally ratified the boundaries," Miller announced. "The Apache territories are officially recognized by federal law." George Burnett grunted approvingly. "Only took them 5 years to see sense." Not all opposition had faded, of course. Chatto, the warrior who had most resented Melanie's presence in the Apache camp, had eventually led a small band of like-minded fighters away from Ulzana's leadership. They continued to raid settlements, rejecting any possibility of peace with the whites. Similarly, hardliners among the settlers like Maxwell Jenkins maintained that the only solution to the Apache problem was complete submission or elimination. But these voices, once dominant, had gradually become the minority as the practical benefits of cooperation became apparent. The trading post served all who came in peace, settlers, soldiers, and native peoples alike. Behind it stood a home that blended elements of both cultures, where Melanie and Ulzana lived in a union that defied convention, yet grew stronger with each passing day. As evening approached, after the council members and Miller had departed, Ulzana took his son's hand. "Come, Thomas, I promise to teach you tracking today." The boy's face lit with excitement. At 4, he was already fluent in both English and Apache, moving between cultures with the natural ease of a child who had never known them to be separate worlds. Later, as the desert cooled with evening's approach, Melanie found Ulzana and Thomas returning from their lesson. Her husband's face held the quiet pride of a father sharing his knowledge, while Thomas clutched a small rabbit track cast in clay, his first tracking trophy. That night, after the children were asleep, Melanie and Ulzana walked hand in hand beneath the vast canopy of stars. It had become their ritual, this moment of solitude together at day's end. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found me in that cave?" Melanie asked. Ulzana considered the question seriously, as he did all things. "I would have continued fighting until I died in battle or of old age in some reservation prison," he finally said. "And so many others with me." Melanie squeezed his hand. "And I would have lived half a life, never knowing what was possible." They stopped at the edge of their property, looking out over the moonlit desert, the same unforgiving land that had nearly claimed Melanie's life and now sustained their shared vision. "I remember being so afraid," she murmured, "not just of you, but of everything the frontier represented. Hardship, violence, loss." "And now?" Ulzana asked, drawing her into his embrace. Melanie looked up at the face that had become as familiar to her as her own, the proud features that their son had inherited, the deep eyes that had first held hers across a burning trading post and changed both their destinies. "Now I know that the true frontier was never the land," she answered. "It was the space between hearts that seemed too different to connect. And we crossed it." Ulzana bent to kiss her, his touch still igniting the same fire after all these years. "We continue to cross it, every day," he said. As they returned to their home, where their children slept peacefully under the protection of two cultures, now learning to coexist, Melanie reflected on the journey that had begun with those words in a hidden canyon. "I finally found you." Words that had proven prophetic in ways neither could have imagined. For in finding each other, they had also found a path toward healing wounds that had seemed beyond mending, a testament to the power of love to transform not just two lives, but the world around them. The challenges were not over, the peace not yet secure beyond all threat, but each day brought new understanding, new allies in their cause. The children who played together in the dusty yard behind the trading post, Apache and settler alike, were growing up with different stories than their parents had known. Stories not of enemies and hatred, but of possibility and respect. Under the vast desert sky, the trading post stood as a beacon of what was possible when courage overcame fear, and understanding triumphed over prejudice. The future remained unwritten, but Melanie and Ulzana would face it as they had faced all challenges, together, bridging worlds with every step. The end. Dear listener, we hope this story brought you a moment of comfort amidst the rush of the day. Like a quiet shelter beneath the desert stars, may it have offered you a pause, a chance to breathe, to feel, and to rest. It is our deepest wish that these words touched not only your imagination, but also your soul. And as you prepare to rest tonight, may you carry with you the warmth of this tale, a soft echo of hope, love, and human connection. Our channel exists for that very reason, to be your gentle refuge after the long hours and duties of the day, a place where stories soothe, inspire, and remind you that your heart matters, that you matter. Our team is devoted to sharing stories that speak to the soul and offer light in the quiet corners of your evening. As you settle in for the night, know that we consider it an honor to be part of your evening ritual. We hope this tale has left your heart a little lighter, your mind a little calmer, and your spirit refreshed for tomorrow's journey. Until we meet again in another story, may your sleep be deep and restorative, filled with pleasant dreams. May you awaken feeling renewed, carrying a small piece of Melanie and Ulzana's resilient spirit with you into a new day. Thank you for spending this time with us. With heartfelt gratitude for allowing us into your evening. Wild West Whispers team. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. We hope it offered a gentle escape, a moment of rest, and a bit of light in your day. From all of us, thank you for supporting this channel. Your presence, your comments, and your kindness keep our passion alive. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. At the end of this video, another powerful story will appear. Click it to continue your journey through more emotional tales like this one.